Hi everyone. Welcome to Blind Injustice with Donya Lee Drinks. I'm Donya Lee, and this is my drink. Hello, lover. Today we are drinking a Pinot Noir with a shot of bourbon. Might sound strange, but you might want to try it. It's my own invention. I call it Dee Dee's Elixir. Give it a whirl. Let me know what you think. Oh, this behind me? Yeah, you must be new here. In this house, we have Taylor walls, and we listen to Taylor's version. All hail the Queen! My name is Donya, and I'm a registered nurse. I'm also a certified nurse legal consultant, which gives me a foot in both the legal and the medical world, which I really love. One of my passions is the Innocence Project and the work that they do. If you're not familiar with the Innocence Project, I encourage you to go back to my first video. I give you some information on how they started, who they are, what they do, why I feel so passionate about it, and some scary statistics about the U.S. justice system that will keep you up at night. On Blind Injustice, we'll cover cases where the exoneree is still in prison, and we'll also cover cases of posthumous exoneration, meaning they were unjustly executed and then later found not guilty. We'll also talk about some current cases that the Innocence Project is working on and how you can help. Last week, we talked about Maurice Hastings, and he was the most recent exoneree of the Innocence Project. Today, we're going to rewind, and we're going to go back to the 1980s and talk about Kirk Bloodsworth. He was the first man freed by DNA. He's also another example of a man who never stopped fighting for himself. Before we start today's case, I need to warn you, if I was being monetized, this video would never make the cut. We're going to be addressing the sexual assault and murder of a child, so if that's a trigger for you, we'll just see you next time. Otherwise, grab whatever you're drinking and let's get started. This was a really difficult and sad case. I had to take a couple of days off after I did the research because it really stuck with me for a while. This case is about Kirk Bloodsworth, but it's also about Dawn Venice Hamilton, our victim. So once again, we have the victim, Dawn, the victimized, Kirk, and also some other victims of a perpetrator who was not caught. Sound familiar? Kirk Bloodsworth was born on October 31st of 1960, and by all accounts, it seems like he really had a pretty stable childhood and family life. He obviously had a good relationship with his father because he would try to call him when he was arrested, and he was really close to his mother, both in childhood and as an adult. When Kirk finished high school, he decided to go into the Marines, but it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, I guess, for him, because after a few years, he decided he didn't want to make a career out of it, and he asked for an honorable discharge, which he was given. He then went back to his hometown to become a waterman. Now, if you don't know what a waterman is, you might be familiar with this movie. The men who worked the Andrea Gale were watermen. He's sitting in a bar one night in 1983, and he meets his first wife, Wanda. Their relationship was kind of doomed from the start. It would just be a lot of bad luck for Kirk from the time he met Wanda for a very long time after. His mother didn't really approve. She was 10 years his senior, and she was a bit unstable. As a matter of fact, she had to practically be carried down the aisle because the morning of her wedding, she thought it would be a good idea to take 2 phenobarbital. Here comes the bride. Kirk has also said that he should have known that his marriage was doomed because on the way to the wedding, he was actually in his best man's car kind of scrounging for a snack. He was hungry, and he finds this old fortune cookie and tears it open, starts munching on the fortune cookie, and unrolls the fortune. It reads, "Turn around now." Unfortunately for Kirk, he would not heed that advice, because if he had, everything would have been different. Why? Because Wanda decides she's too good to be a waterman's wife, and she tells him she's leaving him and going to Baltimore to be with her family. And if he wants to save the marriage, he'll come with her because she's not staying in Cambridge any longer. So he follows her, and that would almost cost him his life. Once they move to Baltimore, things fall apart pretty quickly. They're crammed into a house with 7 people, and Kirk is the only one working. So he's only 22. He doesn't have to put up with that kind of nonsense. And in about 30 days, he's decided he has enough. He goes to employer, pretends to be sick, but needs to grab his paycheck, takes it, and ghosts Wanda. No note, no nothing. He just leaves. And like I said, he was only 22, so I'm going to give him a little grace here because I certainly wouldn't want the mistakes I made at 22 to put me on death row. And of course, when the police find out that he went in there and grabbed his check and just left town, they would constitute that as fleeing because we know how much the police love to constitute fleeing from last week's video. He starts to make his way back to Cambridge. He crashes with some friends along the way. After a few days of not coming home, his wife Wanda files a missing persons report. This is all about to be a storm of really bad circumstances for Kirk. But before we go further with Kirk, I'm going to pause here because I want to talk a little bit about our victim. Dawn Venice Hamilton had kind of a strange start in life. Her mother was very young. She was only 17. Her father was 18. I think her mom had some mental issues. I don't think she was like full-on psych, but I think she was a little mentally unstable, and she realized she was not equipped to raise a daughter. So she took Dawn over to the neighbors. Her name was Mercy. Takes Dawn over to her house and asks Mercy if she would raise Dawn. She even gives her legal guardianship. Now Mercy loves Dawn, and after a couple of years, she realizes she'd really like to adopt her. However, Dawn's father, Thomas, won't allow it. While he's not raising Dawn, he's actually quite close to her. They spend a lot of time together, and he doesn't want to give up his rights as a parent. So Mercy continues to raise her. She's just not able to adopt her. One weekend in July of 1984, Thomas picks up Dawn and takes her to her grandparents' house, Thomas's parents' house. Now, Thomas has to work and lives a little far away from the grandparents' house. So he's not joining Dawn that weekend. He's just taking her there, dropping her off, and then going back home because he needs to work. This will be important later because Thomas will need an alibi, and he's got one, so he's good. Now, Dawn loved going to her grandparents because her aunt and her cousins were always there too, and she always had a great time. They live in a little town right outside of Baltimore called Fontana Village. So on July 25th, the kids get up, have some breakfast, watch some cartoons, and then Eleanor shoos them all out of the house at about 10:30 in the morning. It's not just Dawn, it's Eleanor's 2 children, and also her sister's 2 kids. So she's got 5 kids that she's managing, and she needs to get some stuff done around the house, so she just shoos them outside. Now, before you millennial mamas come after me, this was a really different time. It wasn't unusual for me as a child to get up, watch some cartoons, do my chores, and then leave the house. And lots of times we didn't come back until either dinner time or the street lights came on. Like I said, it was a different, more innocent time. And if we had come home, our parents were probably gone anyway, out playing golf and having drinks with friends. So we just figured out how to make our way in the world. And honestly, it was a really fun time. Our parents assumed we were out there doing our thing, maybe getting in a little bit of trouble, but generally safe for the most part. And they were right. We usually were. So Eleanor's 2 children are Lisa, age 4, and Gary, age 6. And then there's her niece and nephew, Melissa and John. And then there's Dawn. So they all go outside to play. Dawn was wearing blue shorts, a peach shirt, white socks, tennis shoes, and this little gray purse that she took with her everywhere. She was so proud of her first big girl purse that she never went anywhere without it. Now, behind the kitchen window, there's this big field, and just beyond that, there's a pond and some woods. And the kids weren't allowed to go anywhere near the ponds or the woods without an adult present. So they usually just played around in the field. Well, a little while after they've been gone, Missy and Dawn come back and let Eleanor know that the boys had decided to go into the woods. And they wanted her to know that because that was a no-no. So Eleanor tells them to go get the boys, and everybody needs to just come back home. If they can't play according to the rules, they don't get to play outside. So the girls go to get the boys. A little while after that, Eleanor looks out the window and she sees the whole gang coming home. Except for Dawn. Missy said Dawn went into the woods to help find the boys, but she never came back out. So Eleanor's concerned, obviously, and she goes running out into the field, by the pond, into the woods, hollering for Dawn, but there's no answer. There are two little boys that are fishing by the pond. There's Christian, age 10, and his little brother Jackson, age 7, and they're fishing. And they lived in the area, so Eleanor knew them and they knew her. And she asked if they had seen Dawn, and they said yes. Dawn had approached them and asked them to help her find her cousins. But they were busy with this turtle they had just found, and they told her no. But then Christian says, but there was a man sitting up on the hill, and he came down and told Dawn he would help her look, and they went into the woods together. They tell her he was a white man with blonde hair around his face, and it looked like a lion. And he had a mustache. Well, Eleanor goes back home, calls the police, tell them that Dawn is missing, and then she gets in her car. While she waits for them, she gets in her car, and she goes down to this convenience store that kind of circles the woods a little, where local kids hung out a lot, just to see if Dawn might have ended up there, but she wasn't there. But she notices something strange. She notices this man with dark curly hair sitting in his car, not doing anything, not going in the store, not leaving the store, just sitting there in his car. So she approaches him and asks him if he's seen Dawn. He says no. This man's name is Richard Gray, and he'll be important in our story later. When Eleanor gets back home, there are 3 policemen there waiting for her, and she tells them everywhere she's been, who she's talked to, and what she's seen. Meanwhile, Thomas is making his way to Eleanor's house from where he lives. When he gets there, he finds out that the police haven't even started looking for Dawn yet, and he gets kind of mad. And so he goes and hightails it into the woods and starts calling Dawn's name, trying to find her, get her to answer, anything. So he's looking and calling, and he hears somebody whistle at him. And he turns around, and it's Richard Gray. Richard Gray says, I have something I need to show you. And Thomas follows him. Richard leads him to a tree. And in this tree are Dawn's blue shorts that she was wearing and her underwear. So Thomas, of course, is very upset, and he's not even thinking about preserving a crime scene or preserving evidence, because lay people, honestly, before true crime series, weren't wired that way. So he climbs up the tree, grabs the shorts, grabs the underwear, and then runs back to Eleanor's to hand him over to the police. The police asked him where he found the items and how he found the items, and Richard was kind of with him, so he said, this man showed me where they were. And so the police asked Richard to lead them to exactly that spot. Well, on the way, they passed the boys again, and the police asked the boys about this man on the hill, what he looked like, and this would kind of be a good deal, bad deal thing, because the boys actually do a really good job of describing the suspect, except for the height, and that would be a pretty big deal later. They described him as being 6'5", because they had an uncle who was really tall, and he was 6'5". So that's what they said the perpetrator was. Well, Kirk is about 6 feet tall, but Kirk isn't our perpetrator, remember? When the perpetrator is found, he's only 5'6". So they put a lot of weight on these 2 little boys' eyewitness account, which I think is kind of ridiculous because even adult eyewitness accounts fail more often than not. I think you should take 2 children's witness with a huge grain of salt, but they don't. But again, they're able to say, well, he's wearing this short sleeve shirt that's got 3 stripes on it. He was wearing tan shorts, white socks, and sneakers. And again, they mentioned the blonde hair like a lion's mane and a mustache. So that's all pretty good for a couple of little kids, I think. So the police take their statement and then continue to follow Richard to this tree. 25 feet right of the path and about 80 paces from the tree lay 9-year-old Dawn. Her body is still warm, but there's no pulse. And Dawn's little purse is still on her little shoulder. Her head is a bloody mess. It's fractured and depressed in areas. It's got 2 really big, jagged openings, and there's a bloody rock laying next to her head. Her little neck has a herringbone shoe print on it, as does her back. She's naked from the waist down, except her socks and shoes, and there is an 8-inch stick protruding from somewhere it should not be. And that's as much as I'm going to say about that piece of evidence. Evidence recovered from the scene include the aforementioned rock. There was a big red chewing gum wrapper that had chewed gum in it that was at the scene. They grabbed that. There was a blue belt loop, some red fibers, and a single hair. So they are able to collect quite a bit of evidence. There is a shoe print, a herringbone shoe print in a dirt mound. They take a picture of that. They take a picture of the herringbone prints on Dawn's body. They've got quite a bit of evidence. So that part's good. Now, why they wouldn't listen to this evidence later? Well, we know why, but we'll get into that later. Semen is also recovered from Dawn's vaginal and rectal area. The coroner states that she died of strangulation from her neck being stepped on and total brain injury from her skull being crushed with a rock. This would be a horrifying crime for an adult. I cannot imagine how terrified poor little Dawn must have been. Rest in peace, darling girl. As a side note, I just want to say I think that the 2 boys that were fishing in the pond were the intended victims. They mentioned that they had seen this man sitting on a hill before Dawn came down to look for his cousins, and that hill was kind of right behind him. It was just a little hill by the pond. So that means he had been watching the boys, and that's why I think they were probably his intended victims. It's just my opinion, but that's what I think. They bring out a sketch artist to help the boys kind of recall better what the man looked like. But sketch artists then was different than they are now. Now you have an artist that takes like a real-time rendering based on a description. Back then, it was like all these pieces, parts that people had to identify, and then they put a composite sketch together based on that. So these poor little boys, it's like, here's 100 noses, which one looks like his? Here's 75 mouths, try to find his. So they pick all these facial features over and over again and finally come up with this composite sketch. The boys aren't super happy with the sketch, but they can't really figure out why, so they finally decide it's good enough. On July 28th, tip 286 came in from someone who said it kind of looked like Kirk. It was the very next day that Kirk went into his employer and asked for what would be his final check. Kirk was also off the day that Dawn was murdered. So like I said, we've got this perfect storm of circumstantial evidence, but it's just that, circumstantial. They run his background check, and they find out that he's been a Marine, that he was honorably discharged. He was even the discus champion for the Marines. He has no criminal history, no history of violence, but he does match the psychological profile. Let's talk about psychological profiling for a minute. Again, back in the 80s and 90s, psychological profiling was not what it is today. A lot of times the profile was so generic, it matched like half the population, right? But here's what the profiler said about the perpetrator of this crime. They said this was a crime of opportunity, that the perpetrator had not been stalking Dawn or anything like that. The opportunity presented itself and the perpetrator took advantage of it. They said the perpetrator was someone with a lot of repressed rage toward controlling women, that he did not live in the town, that he was just kind of transiently passing through. And all of those things were true for Kirk. So that's not looking very good for him. However, they weren't true for the actual perpetrator of the crime, who was born and raised in the area, and whose other crimes had all taken place with just in a few mile radius of his own home. But for Kirk, this is not looking good at all. So like I said, at first blush, it appears that the police have done a really good job here. They responded immediately when they were called, and they brought in corporals and lieutenants and detectives that specialize in sex abuse cases and detectives that specialize in murder. And pretty soon there are over 100 police officers responding. However, they do allow Thomas to go looking for his daughter on his own, which results in contaminated evidence and contaminated crime scene. They don't try to keep people out of the crime scene. Remember Richard Gray traipsing everywhere, leading people everywhere? They didn't cordon off the crime scene. They didn't try to keep people out, so the crime scene became contaminated. So we've got a lot of specialists looking at this crime scene and trying to figure out what's going on. They're able to preserve a lot of really great evidence. But again, this evidence, there's so much of it that they would reverse engineer every piece of it to point to Kirk's guilt. We've seen that before, remember? Then the FBI falsely reports that there was no semen at the crime scene. They would later recant that statement and reissue a new statement, but it's like, oh, great, here we go. Remember I told you that a footprint was photographed on a dirt mound? That was a size 8 footprint. So right there, that should have told the police it's probably not someone over 6 feet tall. Ding, ding, ding. So like I said, once they received the tip on Kirk, all of that evidence would be reverse engineered to point to his guilt, and it would land Kirk on death row. There are also some witnesses in the area, so let's talk about them for a minute because it's important, because they're useless. Debbie McNamara said that she saw a man with long blonde hair sitting on an electrical box. He wasn't really doing anything, he was just kind of sitting there. She said he had a mustache, and she would later participate in the lineup. Her neighbor, Nancy Hall, also identifies a white male sitting on an electrical box, but she says he's got dark curly hair. Now, who does that sound like? That sounds like Richard Gray. But she's able to give a better description of what the man is wearing. She said he's got a maroon pullover on, doesn't mention any stripes on the sleeve, and he's wearing black khaki pants. She also reports that there was a man named Mickey Manzan that was recently released from prison and had been hanging around the area as well. Hall would later testify for the prosecution, even though her description doesn't match Bloodsworth, doesn't match the composite sketch, but she's going to testify against him in court. Then we have this woman named Donna Ferguson, who describes the same man sitting on the same electrical box, and she describes the blonde hair, but she doesn't say anything about the mustache because she says she didn't see his face. So, she tells the police she doesn't see his face. Yet at court, she would identify Kirk as the person she saw. Again, why do we even believe eyewitnesses? Everybody just kind of wants their 15 minutes of fame, right? And will change their story to fit whatever they're being asked to do. What's the point in that? Then we have Mr. Constantine of Pensbury Place. Doesn't that make you just want to say it in a British accent? Mr. Constantine of Pensbury Place.
That accent is terrible.
Anyway, he says that there's a man named Kimberly Ann Ruffner that's been wanted for a series of crimes against children. That tip would not be taken seriously, but Kimberly Ann Ruffner is Dawn's killer. 2 months after this tip, a young woman would barely escape with her life. He sexually assaults her, tries to kill her with a pair of scissors, but she gets out. She's able to get free and turn him in. So like I said, this man is Dawn's killer, but we wouldn't know that for another 10 years. One of the things I love, though, is guess who was Dawn's biggest advocate for getting justice? The man wrongly accused of her murder. Even after Kirk's own exoneration, he would fight like hell for 10 years for little Dawn to get her justice. So we're talking about witnesses, so let's talk about Richard Gray, the creeper.
Ugh, this guy gives me the heebie-jeebies.
Get ready to get mad, because the things I'm going to tell you are infuriating. First of all, I think this guy was either in cahoots with Kimberly Shea Ruffner, or he just happened to observe and possibly enjoy the crime that was taking place. He just knew too much. So the police bring him in and question him. He's got a spot of blood on his shirt. The police said he was acting really kind of squirrely. They ask if they can search his car, and he gives them permission to do so. But as they're searching his car, he vomits everywhere. Why? because they pull out 3 pair of children's underwear from his car. And the car was a rental. So what do the police do with all this damning evidence? They let him go.
What the hell?
They don't question him about it. They don't ask for his shirt. They don't ask to take a swab of the blood on his shirt. They found him so cooperative and congenial, their words, not mine, that they let him go. Now, even if he didn't have anything to do with this crime, what are you doing with a rental car with 3 pair of children's underwear in there? I don't want to know. Now, let's get back to Kirk Bloodsworth. Remember I told you he was living in that crammed house with 7 people, and so clearly they were broke because he was the only one working. Now, TacoBell had just come out with this brand new salad, and Wanda was dying to try it. And I know it sounds like I'm rabbit trailing here, but trust me, this will be important down the line. Kirk promises her that with his next check, he'll get her this salad and she can try it. But of course, that day doesn't come because when he gets his next check, he takes it and leaves town and leaves Wanda, and she doesn't get her little TacoBell salad. So
Hey, this isn't Taco Bell.
he stays with his cousin, Rose Carson, along the way, and Rose's neighbor decides he looks a lot like the composite sketch and turns him into the police. So the police come and visit Kirk and ask if he would mind coming down to the station to answer a few questions. They don't tell him what it's for, but he cooperates. He agrees to go down to the station. But he's really nervous about it because he's got some pot in his shoe, and he's afraid that he's about to be busted for a marijuana buy. He thinks that's what he's being hauled down there for. And then, of course, because of the herringbone shoe pattern, they want to see the bottom of his shoes. And so that freaks him out even more, and he's sure he's about to be busted. But they look at the bottom of his shoes, and then they ask him to come into this interrogation room with them. And he follows them in there, and he thinks, man, it's all over. I'm about to be arrested. But sitting on the table of that interrogation room is the rock covered in blood from the crime scene, as well as Dawn's underwear. And he's like trying to figure out what that's all about. So they ask him if he had heard about the Dawn Hamilton murder case, and he's like, yeah, of course I have. It's all everybody's talking about. So they asked him a few questions about the murder, and he answered them honestly. He wasn't really nervous about it because he didn't have anything to do with it, so he just answered their questions, and then they let him go home. So he gets home, and Rose is like, what in the world is going on? Because while he was being interrogated by police, Rose found out that his wife had filed a missing persons report. And Kirk said, I've done something really bad. I don't think Wanda will ever be able to forgive me for it. And he's referring to ghosting her and the TacoBell salad, right? But Rose would testify to those words during his trial, and that would look very different. Before they let Kirk go from the interrogation, they asked if they could take a Polaroid of him, and he consents because he's got nothing to hide. So they take a Polaroid of him, and then they show the 2 boys the Polaroid and ask if that's the man. And the boys are very insistent that it's not, because Kirk is kind of a ginger at this point. And if you've noticed, men's facial hair is usually a brighter tone than even the hair on their head. So he's got these bright red sideburns in the Polaroid and red hair. And the boys were like, no, he didn't have sideburns, and he had blonde hair. And I'm sure the boys were like irritated. How many times do I have to repeat? Lion's mane. He was blonde. He wasn't a redhead. But apparently they're not the police's favorite witnesses anymore because they won't corroborate the Polaroid. So instead, at 2 a.m, they go knocking on the door of Rose and Kirk. They're banging down the door practically. Kirk answers the door, and they swiftly place him under arrest for the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Dawn Venice Hamilton. Keep in mind, he's only 22. He's just still practically a baby himself. He must have been terrified. He asks repeatedly to call his father or to be able to contact a lawyer, and all of those requests are denied. He would serve 8 years, 10 months, and 19 days for a murder he did not commit. 2 of those years on death row, right above the gas chamber. After being arrested, the police place him in a lineup. He's number 6. They bring the boys in to take a look at the lineup, and they can't identify him. They don't identify anyone in the lineup. Now, the other witnesses would participate in the lineup as well, and all the witnesses are under strict instruction not to read the newspaper and not to watch TV. And guess why that is? Because the dumbass police department allowed Kirk's arrest to be filmed. So now his face is everywhere. It's saturating the media on newspapers and television. So this is very damning for Kirk. So obviously, guess what every witness does? Watches TV. The boys, they're unable to identify him, and their parents bring them home. That night, after the news is on, the parents call the police department and said, "Oh, the boys made a mistake. They just told us it's number 6. Debbie McNamara would also ID him from the lineup after watching television. Kirk's trial takes place in March of 1985. And it's so strange. I see March of 1985, and all I think about is my 18th birthday. And it's so odd to think that while you're turning 18, someone else is out there fighting for their very life. There was 8 months of preparation for the trial, and Kirk has said later that he found the whole experience to be very damning. On the way to court for his appearance, his own attorney even said, "Why don't you just confess, man? Everybody knows you did it." And this was a gut punch to Kirk, because he thought at least his own attorney believed he was innocent. So now he realizes nobody's fighting for him. Nobody believes in his innocence. It's just him. During the trial, the boys would insist that Kirk was not the perpetrator. They stated again and again the lion's mane blonde hair, and Kirk obviously had auburn hair, so the boys testified that it was not him. But do the police or the judge or the jury or anybody take that testimony seriously? Of course they don't. They would rather count on the testimony of people who didn't actually see the perpetrator but could still identify Kirk as the perpetrator, because that makes more sense.
What is wrong with you people?
Just like in our last case, they are not concerned about solving a crime. They are only concerned about closing a case. Over 500 tips would come in on this crime. Kirk was number 286. The other 170 plus were never even followed up on. Television at its finest. The jury only gives this man's life 2.5 hours of consideration before returning with a guilty verdict and sentencing him to death row. Like I said earlier, his death row cell was directly above the gas chamber. He would be there for 2 years. This case, my friends, is a case of wrongful conviction. Also, witness misidentification and rush to judgment. Overzealous prosecution, tunnel vision, poor investigation, and government misconduct. Let me tell you why. They allowed Richard Gray and everybody else to just stomp on through the crime scene. They didn't preserve it correctly. Several vaginal and rectal swabs went missing. Nobody took a blood sample from Kirk to type it. How do you do that? There's blood all over that crime scene. Some of it had to be the perpetrator if she was fighting. But they don't even type Kirk? They didn't take a semen sample from him either. And let me tell you why this would be important. The world kind of falls into 2 groups of people. There are secretors and non-secretors. And here's the difference. A secretor will secrete their blood type into all of their bodily fluids. So if you're a woman, it's in your vaginal fluids. If you're a man, it's in your semen, it's in your saliva. Wherever you have bodily fluids, your blood type will be in that fluid. Non-secretors only secrete their blood type in their actual blood. So, this is important. Why? Well, if the perpetrator had been a secretor and Kirk was a non-secretor, that's a no-brainer right there. There's no confusing that. That's like DNA almost, It's a done deal. He would be able to go. Now, we don't know for sure if that had been the case. Maybe they both were secretors. Maybe they were both non-secretors. Unfortunately, we'll never know because they didn't test it. So with those 500 tips that came in, there were 200 suspects. Only 10 would be followed up on. Remember I told you that print size was a size 8? Well, the shoes that they removed from Kirk's belongings are a size 10.5. But somehow the prosecution manages to convince the jury that if a perpetrator wants to throw off the crime scene or throw off investigators, they would be willing to shove their 10.5 foot into a size 8 shoe just to throw everybody off. And the jury buys it.
Those shoes look a little small for you.
This next part is a big deal. There were several Brady violations. Now, the Brady disclosure law is a really important law in justice. If you've ever seen the movie My Cousin Vinny, you'll know what I'm talking about. But it basically requires the prosecutor to share any incriminating evidence with the defense. So it's a fair playing field on both sides.
Honey, where did you read about all that disclosure shit?
When the prosecutors came across any really damning evidence about Kirk, they were supposed to share that with the defense, but they didn't, and the defense ended up being blindsided. Brady violations are a very big deal. When the police put together a photo array, they're supposed to have very similar looking people in the photo array. So if somebody's able to identify one person, or several people can identify one person, they're pretty sure that's their suspect because they all look kind of similar, so this guy must really be the guy, right? Well, in Kirk's photo array, he's the only one in the entire array that looks remotely like the composite sketch.
It's a trap!
In closing statements, the prosecution made some very inflammatory statements that I can't even say on this channel. Now, we all know that the opening and closing statements are a little more loosey-goosey than the evidence presented at trial, but there are still some basic guidelines that must be followed. The prosecutors decided that wasn't for them. They don't have to follow any guidelines, and they didn't. They broke some rules, and they were not called on it. Those were the last statements the jury would hear before their painstakingly thorough deliberation of 2.5 hours. So there's all this misconduct. And Kirk will file several appeals based on all of this misconduct. And of course, most of them will be denied. However, the Brady violations got him a new trial. In 1986, Kirk is granted a new trial, but unfortunately he is found guilty again by a jury. Now, the judge presiding over this jury did not agree with their verdict, and judges have the ability to exercise the right to overrule the jury's verdicts. They're not supposed to use that unless they're really sure, and this judge elected not to use that right. He did not overrule the jury. However, he did pull the death penalty off the table and instead sentenced Kirk to life without the possibility of parole. Now, because of the nature of these crimes, Kirk was in real danger in prison. Even in prison, there's a hierarchy of acceptable crimes, and child crimes are at the very bottom of that list. So Kirk would find himself getting catcalled and threatened constantly while he was in prison. This is buffered somewhat by visits from his mom. His mother would come visit him whenever she could. And one of the things she has always said to Kirk from the time he was a young boy is stand up. Whether it was standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves, standing up for yourself, growing a pair and being a man. It could mean all those things. It could mean different things at different times. But she said that to him continuously growing up. And he held on to that. That would become his mantra the entire time he was in prison. Stand up. It would keep him going and keep him fighting for himself. Unfortunately, his mother passed away while he was in prison, just 5 months before he would be exonerated. Kirk worked in the prison library, and so he was in charge of opening all the books and the donations and things that came in, deciding what was appropriate, what to keep, what not to keep. He also got first dibs at everything because he was the one opening all the boxes, right? So he gets this shipment in one day, and there's 4 books in there. The first book is How to Make Origami, which he's not really interested in, so he sets that one aside. There's one on pastel drawings that holds his attention, so he sets that one aside for himself. Then, for reasons I will never understand, somebody decides to send into the prison the joy of sex. Now, I just think that's mean, honestly, but he has no use for that, so he sets it aside away from him. And then there's this book called The Blooding. And this book would save Kirk's life. The Blooding is the story of two young girls who were murdered in 1983 and 1986 in Leicestershire, UK. Now, Leicestershire is just like right smack dab in the middle of the United Kingdom. Even though these crimes were 3 years apart, the MO was exactly the same. It was super clear that the same guy committed both of these murders. So the UK police want to get on this because they don't want any more girls to die. They don't have the hyper privacy, hyper rights that the United States has. And I say hyper because I think we go a little overboard sometimes, but they don't. So the police there demand that every man in the area, and if you look on a map, it's a pretty big area, that every man in the area submit a blood sample. The perpetrator, whose last name is Pitchfork, obviously does not want to submit a blood sample. So he bribes this baker to submit a blood sample for him. But unfortunately, he bribed a big mouth baker because he started bragging to people about how much money he was making by submitting a blood sample for this guy. Well, the right person overhears it and turns him into the police. He gets in trouble and Pitchfork has to submit the blood sample. It's him. He goes to prison. So Kirk reads this book with utter fascination. And he's like, you know, if this kind of evidence can get you convicted, can it also set you free? By this time, he's been in prison almost 10 years. And he writes letters to Anne Brotes, who is the prosecutor for the state at the time, asking to have DNA run from the evidence that was available. Anne writes back to Kirk and tells him all the evidence has been destroyed. Where have we heard that before? Kirk now has an attorney named Bob Moran. Bob Moran was known in legal circles as the guy who tries to get falsely accused people out of prison. The Innocence Project wasn't a thing quite yet, but Bob was that guy. And Kirk knew that Bob was that guy, and Kirk wanted that guy. So Kirk just continues and continues and continues to write letters to Bob, begging him to at least meet with him and hear his story. Finally, Bob relents and goes to see Kirk. And he has said from the minute he met Kirk, he knew that he was not guilty, and he took him on as a client. So Kirk tells Bob about this book and how this man was prosecuted. And Bob gets pretty excited, so he goes to the courthouse and he demands to get the evidence. He has shelled out $10,000 of his own money to have the DNA tested. Because back then, DNA was barely a thing, and it was even more expensive to run those kinds of tests than it is now. So he goes to the courthouse and he asks to see the evidence in the Dawn Venice Hamilton case. And he is told that that evidence was destroyed. It exists no longer. Bob is devastated. I mean, he's just crushed. And he's walking out of the courthouse when a court clerk that he used to work with back in the day sees him, and he's kind of like, "Why so glum, John?" And then Bob proceeds to tell this clerk about the work he's doing for Kirk and the evidence in the Dawn Hamilton case and how it's been destroyed and how upset he is about it. And the court clerk says that evidence isn't destroyed. It's in the judge's chambers. Now, can I just say ew for a minute? What is a judge doing with a little girl's underwear in his chambers? I don't want to know. But anyway, Bob and this court clerk go in the judge's chambers and they start looking for this evidence. And they finally find Dawn's underwear in a paper bag in the judge's closet. But because the evidence was so poorly preserved, Kirk's freedom would hang on the hope of the replication of one half of one cell. So they wait. And guess what? They replicated the DNA. And guess what? It's not Kirk's. But we already knew that, right? So Kirk said it was really funny. He was in prison doing his prison thing, and they tell him he's got a phone call from his attorney. And he goes to take it, and Bob is on the other line just beside himself. He's like, "You didn't do it, man!" And Kirk was all like, yeah, I know. He just thought it was really funny. He receives that call the morning of April 1993. He was exonerated in June of 1993. So again, we've got that 2-month waiting period. And again, if anybody can explain that to me in the comment section below, I'd appreciate it. I mean, I get waiting till the next morning maybe, but I don't understand why he's got to sit in there and rot for 2 more months. So Monday, June 28th, 1993, he's set free. He makes a beeline for his mom's house, which of course is empty now because she's gone. But he said that next morning he had the best buttered toast of his entire life sitting at that kitchen table. Shortly after, Kirk would go to work for the Innocence Project. He also travels all around and tells his story. If you put his name in the Google search engine, you'll see a lot of things come up, a lot of newscasts about when he was exonerated. He's got a documentary out there. A lot of his speeches that he does all around are on there as well. So if you're interested in looking further, all those things are out there. But they're pretty much in the story, so I covered it all. This is Kirk now. But for Kirk, his own exoneration wasn't enough. He wanted to get justice for Dawn. So in 1994, when the CODIS database is developed, he starts campaigning hard for the DNA evidence to be run against the CODIS database to see if they can get a hit for Dawn's real killer. And for some reason, he's denied over and over again. And I don't get this. It's not like they're trying to save face, right? Because they already screwed up. They already had to exonerate a man that was in prison for something he didn't do. So it's not like running this DNA is going to make them look bad because they already look really bad.
Stupid courts, stupid cops, stupid city.
So I don't understand why they keep denying him. He would push this cause for 10 years. It takes them 10 years to try to get justice for Dawn. When they finally do run the DNA, they get a hit immediately because the perpetrator is already in prison. Remember I told you about that woman who barely escaped with her life? He was going to stab her with scissors. She was able to identify him, and he was serving 45 years for that. He was also Dawn's murderer. So if the police hadn't been so tunnel-visioned on Kirk, they may have caught Kimberly, and this poor woman may not have ever had to have been attacked, which I'm sure was very traumatizing for her. Now here's something really incredible. Kimberly is doing time in the prison that Kirk was doing time in. They knew each other. They would work out in the gym together. Kirk would bring him library books. Kimberly even knew that Kirk was trying to get the crime DNA tested to exonerate him. They knew each other. Man, if I was Kirk, that would piss me off. I'm just saying. So who is Kimberly Shea Ruffner? Well, he was identified early on as a suspect by our Mr. British Fancy Pants, Mr. Constantine of Pensbury Place, named Kimberly. Remember that he was wanted in a string of child sexual crimes? Yeah, Mr. British Fancy Pants was right. This is Kimberly Shea Ruffner. This is the composite sketch. See the hair? Blonde. No sideburns. As far as Kimberly goes, I couldn't really find a lot about his background or his family, childhood, upbringing, anything like that, except that he had always lived like 6 miles from that Fontana Village area. He'd always lived right there, and his crimes were always very local to around where he lived. I did, however, find a history of crimes against children. In the early 1980s, Kimberly Shea Ruffner was charged with at least 3 sexual assault charges against children. He would not do time for any of them. The charges were either dropped, or in one case, in the sexual assault of an 11-year-old girl, the jury deadlocked, and the state decided not to prosecute again. So he was set free. Hold on to your hats. This was 2 weeks before Dawn's murder. 2 weeks. If they had found him guilty or decided to hold him over in jail and re-prosecute, Dawn would not have died. So I guess he decided, since all these children were identifying him now, that the next time he was going to have to kill his victim. That's the only conclusion I can come to why Dawn was killed and none of his other victims ever were. He was described as a quiet man who kind of kept to himself in prison, and I can understand why, since he had to see Kirk's innocent ass every day.
You think?
Kimberly Ann Ruffner receives a life sentence on top of the 45 years in prison he's already serving. He only confesses because the prosecutors threatened him with the death penalty, and they agreed to take it off the table if he confessed. When asked if he had anything to say, Kimberly replies, "There's really nothing I can say." Really, Kimberly? You've got nothing to say? How about, "I'm sorry, I'm such a total piece of shit who liked to sexually assault and murder children and then let somebody else hang out to dry for it"? How about that, Kimberly? You could have said that. Kirk would say that he could forgive Ruffner for allowing him to take the hit for the crime that Kimberly had committed, but that he cannot forgive him for what he did to Dawn. He said that's someone else's to handle. Kirk went to work to overturn the death penalty in Maryland, and in 2013 he was successful. It was signed into law that execution was unconstitutional in the state of Maryland. Remember I said that Kirk was exonerated and set free in 1993? Well, in 2021, the state of Maryland finally decides to offer him some compensation for the time that he served. 2021. That's 27 years for those of you who don't feel like doing the math, because I'll always do the math. So for 27 years, they have not financially compensated him at all. And when they do, it really sucks. He gets $85,000 for a housing allowance and $400,000 because he would have been making about $33,000 a year as a waterman. So more than 27 years later, you're going to give him $121.77 a day for being in prison 2 years on death row. Maryland, you can do better.
You will do better. You must do better. You will do better. You must do better.
Once again, innocent until proven guilty? I don't think so. That's it for today, kids. Tell me your thoughts below about this case, how you feel about how Kirk handled it, how the police handled it, any thoughts you have about Kimberly. But again, please don't go overboard. Any bullying will not be tolerated on this channel. Don't bully each other's comments, and don't say disparaging things about the victims in this story. Your comments will be deleted if you do. If you keep it up, I'll just block you from the channel altogether because I can. And if you're interested in doing your part, it's easier than you think. You know, they've got this 23andMe and Ancestry thing where you can just swab your DNA and they'll send you a profile. You can take that profile report and upload it to GEDmatch. What does GEDmatch do? They're a group of genetic genealogists, and their group is to create these big family trees. When they can't find a criminal, they can find some of the DNA that the criminal may share with somebody else, and it's helped them track down a lot of killers. They don't share your DNA with anybody else, and honestly, those with nothing to hide nothing, right? So I was really excited. I had already done the 23andMe thing because I thought it would be fun, and it was. But now I can upload that profile to GEDmatch. Do I want to be related to a criminal? No. But if I am, do I want to do my part? Absolutely. And as always, I've left a link to the Innocence Project in the comment box below if you'd like to get on their site, see a little more about what they do and how you can help. Otherwise, I'll see you soon. Until next time, be kind, don't be a Karen, and stay in your lane. Bye.